All right. So now we are entering the mind region. So mind region is above sixth point. So like I was explaining, like the fifth until the fifth region, fifth point is called the heart region. So like any and the regular understanding of a region is like an area, place. So as we go to the higher points, the regions become very vast. So now from point 6 through 9, as you see in the picture here, is called the mind region. Actually, in fact, here it says in the text 6 through 12 is called mind region. And within that, we'll understand some sub-regions. But like I said, as you're going up, the regions become vast. So once I kind of drew a picture and Daji corrected me, I kind of drew something like this. As we are going higher, I drew like this. Yellow is not a good color to see. Okay. I drew something like this. And Daji said it is not like this. It should be like this. See, as we are going higher and higher, you will see this regions are getting vast, right? Even in one of the Da Vinci Code's book, it shows the V shape. There is so much discussion on this V shape because, see, here our consciousness is narrow. But as we are moving upwards, our consciousness is also expanding. That's why we call the expansion of consciousness, because as you move higher, this small consciousness cannot help. The narrowed consciousness is only to the attending to the external world, understanding the external world. It is very limited in scope. But to understand, to cognize the divine essence, these higher vibrations are nothing but subtler, more serene, more subtler vibrations. We cannot cognize with this limited, contracted consciousness. That's why for someone who has not subjected to the spiritual practice, theoretically they might understand, they might hear, but they cannot appreciate it because they cannot experience it with the contracted consciousness. How much ever, so that's why at a lower state of mind, we have to use lot of emotion to say I am a devote of the Lord. The only element they use for the devotion is emotion. But as you grow into this expanded consciousness, the same devotion transforms into feeling. And from feeling, we kind of start the identification with it. We start identifying with it. You know, there is something every life, not just humans, every life, what it tries to protect is its identity. And that's why, in order to see when the animals mark their territory, why they mark their territory? Because they try to identify themselves with that place. See, similarly, we also identify ourselves with many things. There are layers and layers of identities. But as our consciousness is expanding, we form a new identity. The new identity is the feeling of the divinity within us. We own it. We try to become that. The becoming cannot be understood from an emotional. the lower, or when I say lower, it's a contracted conscious state. When it is higher, it is the same conscious state expanded, right? It's like you take the bucket of water from the ocean. It's the same water in the bucket, but it has a limited volume. It doesn't vibrate, or there are no waves in your bucket of water which is caught from the ocean, correct? So that's why it's a limited. In order to understand the vast ocean, you have to plunge into that vast ocean. Same thing is happening here. The same water, the same consciousness is now here, it is expanded. This at the lower state, it is like the water in the bucket caught from the ocean, right? So that's why it is essential to understand this aspect of consciousness. So as you are going to the higher and higher regions, now we start tend to identify ourselves with the divine. That's the that's the you cannot say culmination. This identification is almost the beginning of spirituality. That's why Babuji said, see, once you cross the heart region, means heart region is a bodily region. So in the heart region, your identification is with your body. Body doesn't mean just the body. It's all emotions. That's why you see the opposite of emotions when we are talking about the lower points. Anger versus calmness and things like that, right? Clarity versus confusion. So we are talking about all human interactions, emotions in the heart region. But now we are transferring into the feeling, and then as we go higher and higher, the identification begins. So that's what we are learning in the next chapters as we are going into the higher regions. Okay. So here I'll stop for any comments, questions. Okay. So now let's start reading. When someone asks where we feel things, we point to the heart. If someone asks where we think, we point to the head. But where does our sense of self, your ego, live? You cannot pinpoint a location. That's because ego is an illusion. But it's necessary because it endows the soul with identity. Like I said, identity. So this is the sometimes we say identity is the problem. Sometimes we say identity is an advantage also. That's why ego, as even though I'm kind of surprised ego is said as an illusion, in a sense, there are two ways of looking at ego is as much as it's real and it's as much as it's uh, unreal illusion. See, when you say identity, so whenever we say ego, attribute someone's we attribute this ego to someone's arrogance or their behavior, their approach towards people. That's what we kind of think of ego, but that's not in a real term. From a spiritual aspects, ego being the part of the subtle body, the inner consciousness. Here, the ego is your identity. In Hindi, they call it your pehchan. How do you identify yourself? So, we start our identity with the body, how I look. Then, what I have, what I possess, becomes my identity. Okay. If I am a rich or poor, becomes my identity. Then comes which culture I belong to. which religion I subscribe to, which nationality I belong to, right? Which country I belong to. So, like that, there are layers and layers of identities which take place. But one real identity the ego is missing is this divinity within us. This divinity is all pervading, so it is within us. And we forget that. We forget because we don't forget because we our mind, our consciousness has not expanded to an extent where it identifies this divinity within us. Once it starts recognizing, realizing, and that starts to develop into our identity. So, to appreciate the need for ego, imagine the soul at the moment of creation. It is now separate from the source. You should read this reference from Lalaji's book, The Truth Eternal. All around it is the celestial boom of creation and the universe in a state of frenzied expansion. In such setting, the soul was gripped with fear and an illusion of engagement. So if you read Lalaji's Truth Eternal, he says, now the soul, the first mind, he calls it, the first mind when it is formed at the time of creation, it's realizing that it is separated from this essence. And in that separation, the first impression which we develop, the first mind has developed, is fear of separation. The moment there is a fear of separation, now it likes to protect. You know, what is the highest fear a human can experience? The highest fear a human is thinks of is death. Why? Death becomes such an such a what do you call horror thing, because it's the annihilation of the body. Why annihilation of the body is such a horror thing, horrifying thing? Because we identify ourselves first mostly with the body. And we think everything associated with that body, that means all this external world disappears. So that's why it becomes a more horrifying thing. See, you see how we are protecting our identities with so much, so dearly. We don't want to let go. That's why there is so much talk about detachment. Detachment is not that I have to leave everything. Detachment is to leave these identities which we have created, identities which we have associated with. That is the real detachment. So the feeling of I created from that time onward took the form of ego. And it's in its purest form, the ego gave the soul the support it needed in finding meaning and purpose. So the whole goal, everything we are talking about, is to leave these illusionary identities, because here the ego is an illusion because its identities are illusionary, and develop that real identity which is divine and eternal. Everything else is ephemeral. Because it is ephemeral, if I associate my identity with something which is not lasting, obviously I have to exercise so much in my life to protect that identity. If something is eternal, can never be lost, if such is my identity, see how free I become. You understand the concept there. If you don't, I can repeat it again. Okay, let me repeat. Anything which is short lived, which can be lost, If that becomes my identity, it will be anyway be lost. But I have to use enormous energy mentally and from my ego to protect it. I have to engage on it continuously because somehow we know, or intuitively we know, it will be lost. But imagine if your mind is associated with is something eternal, it will never be lost. You know it. Then how free you become, because it will never be lost, you don't have to protect it. So if you develop such an identity, your mind becomes free. Your mind becomes free not because of your detachments with the ephemeral things. Your mind becomes free because of your attachment, or now your new developed identity, which is eternal. Yes, please. Is there a question, Chandra? You raised your hand.
Yeah, yeah, Shrikant.
Mhm.
So I do understand, right? But um, this, short-lived things. What do I call, right? Identity, identifying. How? I mean, I think I get it because you don't want to attach it, but again, that's where the whole fear, right? Whole cycle starts. But how do you balance it? How? But you do it so that you don't attach it, or is that what I mean? You have to go on above that, right?
I'll give you a very simple example. See, this is the problem of humans. See, I always give this example. Suppose you enter a room which is very dark and you can reach the light switch. Now your hand is on the light switch. In order to let go the darkness, will you turn on the light, or you'll keep saying darkness go away, I'll turn on the light? Which one would you do?
Yeah, turn on the light.
Turn
Yes.
on the light so the darkness goes away. But when it comes to this spiritual things, we are trying to push away what is not necessary before the real thing comes in. See, we are applying a reverse logic. That's why Babuji calls it invertendo. We apply the reverse logic. And so now your question is more on how do I detach more than how do I attach to the real thing. Once you attach to the real thing, that becomes your most important identity. When you see, it's like this: when a kid, you give a candy to the kid, and if another kid snatches that candy, the kid is miserable. Why? Now, because the kid is now identified itself with that candy, right? Now, such a simple thing. Now, when you become an adult, if I give you the candy or your kid snatches away that candy, you are not miserable. You will say, hey, you want one more candy.
Mm.
Why? You have now grown out of that attachment, your identity with that candy. It is that simple. Once your mind matures into this identity of the divine, you can still have the candy, but you are not miserable without the candy. You are not worried, how do I protect this candy from other kids?
Mm.
You understand?
Yeah.
That is the thing. So it is developing this higher identity rather than losing lower identities uh, is not the issue. How do I develop this higher identity? That is the thing we are working on. That's why, fundamentally, in religion and spirituality, what is the difference is religion tells you to get rid of your candies. Spirituality tells you to find this higher divine within. That's the only difference. Because religion does not know how to give you this higher identity. Though it introduces the God concept, but it does not tell you how do you develop your identity with that God. Because there is no process there other than worshiping and praising the Lord. That's a fundamental difference. But without religion, you cannot have spirituality. Because religion builds that base, your basement. Without the basement, without the foundation, you cannot have a building, right? So that's why it plays a very important role in our life. So that's the idea of this identity and how we kind of grow into this, you know, I don't call it special, but I call it real, the real essence, how we can develop. So once we develop this eternal identity, then there is no fear of death, all fear drops. Fear of losing anything drops. Our future projections, our worries, everything pretty much drops as you are developing this higher identity. So it is not that you developed detachment, that which is not, that which is ephemeral, short lived, automatically detaches from your mind. So that's why the spiritual progress becomes essential. Spiritual progress is nothing but expansion of this consciousness into higher dimensions. All these points represent a level of dimension, conscious dimension, you can call it, or higher dimensions. So that's the whole idea. So I think it's about time. So before I stop the recording, if you have any comments, questions, please let me know. All right.